Welcome to the 28storms.com update on Tropical Storm Emily as of this Tuesday afternoon, August 2nd. Emily is still nothing more than a minimal tropical storm, and it's expected to remain a minimal to moderate tropical storm as it begins to make its way through the Dominican Republic and Haiti as we work our way into late Wednesday night and Thursday morning. Now, despite moving over some of the very high terrain of Hispaniola, it is still expected to reemerge into the southwest Atlantic and Bahamas as a minimal tropical storm on Friday morning before beginning to parallel the eastern side of the Florida Peninsula. Now, toward the second half of the weekend, the track still takes this off in the general direction of the Carolinas, but that does not necessarily mean that the Hurricane Center is anticipating a Carolina landfall. The latest model guidance is in strong agreement that this storm will make a direct hit across much of interior Hispaniola before moving off into the Bahamas. And also notice, unlike yesterday, we see a few more models have shifted into the eastern Atlantic. We still have a couple models out here in the southeast Gulf of Mexico, but the current consensus is just east of Miami, Florida. The most recent satellite imagery combined with the latest data from the hurricane hunters does indicate that Emily is becoming a little bit more intense this afternoon. Although the center is still a bit stretched out and elongated, the center is located along the northwest edge of the strongest convection. If we turn on the latest infrared, here's the convective center, and also the mid-level circulation is more than likely wrapped up within the strongest cloud tops, but once again that low-level center is displaced ever so slightly here to the northwest. And the reason why this storm is still a little bit lopsided is because Emily has begun to outrun the favorable upper-level ridge axis that was once located directly over the storm. As a result, Emily is becoming a little bit more susceptible to northwesterly wind shear and dry air, and this is evident on satellite imagery. As you can see, that northwest quadrant has been restricted, and that's the main reason why Emily has not been able to steadily strengthen. The latest SIMS wind shear analysis does indicate a very favorable environment, but it is displaced ever so slightly to the south of the center of Emily here. And once again, the storm is just a little bit too close to that mid to upper level trough axis now over Puerto Rico and Hispaniola. And you can also see this a little bit differently on the other representation. We have 15 to 20 knots of westerly wind shear across the northern end of the storm. The latest precipitable water animation also reveals that some of the dry air over the western Atlantic is being wrapped into the low-level circulation of Tropical Storm Emily. Now, if convection were to persist, then some of that dry air could eventually get mixed out of the storm, but by the time Emily begins to beat the dry air, it will more than likely be located over Hispaniola by that point. The intensity models keep Tropical Storm Emily as nothing more than a moderate tropical storm. They only show some very weak intensification before it makes landfall along Hispaniola, and then after it makes landfall we begin to see a slight drop off in the intensity, and then once it begins to reemerge back over the southwest Atlantic and eventually the Bahamas, we do see some models taking this up toward a minimal category 1, but this part of the forecast is highly uncertain as it's unknown as to what the exact structure of Emily will look like once it begins to reemerge back over water. The latest water vapor across North America shows that we still have a very persistent mid to upper level ridge over the south central United States, and that's helping to amplify the trough currently over the eastern seaboard, and this trough is the main reason why Emily is expected to gain much more of a northerly component over the next 2 to 3 days, thus the reason why we do anticipate Emily tracking more so over the Bahamas. We can also see the trough on the SIMS low-level steering analysis. Now, one thing you may often hear is that if a tropical system remains relatively weak in nature, then it more than likely has a greater chance of missing the trough that is expected to cause recurvature, but that is not always the case. This is a primary example right here. We're looking at the current pattern once again. Here's the trough in the low levels, but it's also well into the mid levels as well. So therefore, despite the intensity of the storm, whether it be a tropical depression or even a Category 2 hurricane, the trough is located in the low to mid levels of the atmosphere, and therefore the storm would recurve regardless of the current setup. Now, of course, this forecast is a little bit more tricky than just that, because some of the models are showing the ridge beginning to return over the western Atlantic, and then it's just a matter of whether or not the trough will be reinforced in the 4 to 5 day range. So we are now taking a look at the 12Z GFS. Here is the developing tropical storm. The long wave trough is currently in place over the West Atlantic, and once again there is the ridge. So as this begins to evolve, we see that Tropical Storm Emily is expected to make it directly over Hispaniola by early Thursday morning. The trough is beginning to lift out over the Western Atlantic, and then by Let's see here. This is early Friday morning. Emily is now beginning to pass through the extreme southeast Bahamas. That trough is now definitely beginning to lift out. But also notice the reinforcing shot beginning to move out from the Midwest. There's a shortwave trough beginning to move through south central Illinois, and that will be the reinforcing shot that this storm needs. And therefore, this trough begins to weaken the western extent of the ridge. So down the road here, the GFS is showing a turn away from the United States east coast. And by day 6, we have a lot more long wave troughing along the entire eastern seaboard, making this nothing but a threat to shipping interest down the road. We're now about to look at the 12Z CMC forecast, and this is fairly significant because if you recall, the CMC has been the westernmost model by taking this across the Greater Antilles and eventually into the southeast Gulf of Mexico. Well, here's today's shift. It shows the low pressure center now moving up the eastern side of Florida, and by day 6 it's becoming absorbed by a non-tropical trough off the east coast while moving safely out to sea. The GFS and Canadian CMC now have strong support from the 12Z ECMWF. Once again, there's the storm, there's the trough. Day 1, 2, 3. The initial trough is lifting out. The storm, you can barely see it on the European, but here is the low center just to the north of Cuba here. By 96 hours, that trough is continuing to move away from the western Atlantic. We now have a lot of troughing along the east coast of the United States, or ridging along the U.S., but the storm is relatively weak. It's not even a tropical depression based on this solution. It's just to the east of West Palm Beach over the northern Bahamas here. But then by 120 hours, we begin to see a reinforcing shot beginning to move through the Tennessee and Ohio Valley. And then by day 6, we have very prominent troughing now across much of the eastern seaboard, which would safely turn this away from the east coast of the United States. Also, very quickly before I wrap up today's video, much of Puerto Rico is still under a tropical storm warning, and that's primarily because some of the outer bands of Emily could still produce tropical storm force winds, but the center is most certainly going to pass more toward your south and west as the storm overall moves more in the direction of Hispaniola. But as you can see, even today we already have an increase in the daily shower activity, and you can even begin to make out the low-level circulation located right over here on the long-range radar. So just to sum up today's thoughts, Tropical Storm Emily should remain nothing more than a moderate tropical storm as it continues across the northern Caribbean. The intensity forecast becomes a little bit more problematic as it begins to move over the Bahamas. Again, that is greatly dependent on what the overall structure will be like once it begins to move away from Hispaniola. As of right now, the intensity model consensus would indicate that this will be nothing more than about a moderate to strong tropical storm at the most, but we can't entirely rule out a minimal hurricane for the Bahamas, so just keep a close watch on that. Now, as for Florida, you still need to keep a close watch on this system. Obviously, the model guidance is not that far away from you, so definitely keep up with the weather over the next 72 hours. Although, if I had to take a guess, I would say that the system has more so about a 70% chance of remaining to the east of the Florida Peninsula based on that trough coming in the medium range, and that trough is gaining model support run by run here. And for anyone in the southeast Gulf of Mexico, I really do not foresee this storm posing any threat whatsoever. This is more so of an east coast threat, and specifically more so for Florida. But even Florida, the chances don't look all that good for a direct hit, at least as of right now. But again, we've seen how much the models have been flipping back and forth, so definitely stay tuned with things. And check back soon for another update from 28storms.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel along with our Facebook page because we have frequent updates throughout the day and evening hours. So thanks again and have a good day.